Hello. I wonder if you've heard Tearfun's coronavirus message. I think it's rather good. Only 12 words. Stay at home. Keep your distance. Wash your hands. Have good theology. It's that last triplet of words that makes it different from the message given through secular media. Theology, of course, is the study and understanding, in measure at least, of the nature of God. And in times like these that we're living through with the coronavirus pandemic, when life for so many people is turned upside down, it's at times like these that we need to have a good Bible-based theology. In suffering, often the question is asked, where is God when life hurts? But I think at the present time, it's often Christians that are asking questions. Many Christians are asking three questions, I think. Perhaps you've asked them also. And they are, why is this happening? Is this virus a judgment from God? Is this a sign of the end times? Which leads us to realize that we do need to have a good theology about God and about suffering. Well, we've talked about that theology having to be Bible-based, of course. So let's turn to God's Word. And I'd like to share with you from the text, which is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, at least the first 11 verses. I learned some time ago that the Apostle Paul here shares three reasons why God in his sovereignty may allow suffering to come into our lives. And I'd like to pass it on and share it with you at this time. So 2 Corinthians chapter 1, please. And initially, I'd like to read 5 verses with you, from verse 3 through verse 7. And I'm reading from the NASU again. And when I read it, I want you to listen out for the words, so that. We're going to find them 3 times in the first 11 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And each time they introduce for us one of the reasons that Paul shares why God allows suffering to come into our lives. So let's read from verse 3, shall we? Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is abundant through Christ. But if we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. Or if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which is effective in the patient enduring of the same sufferings which we also suffer. And our hope for you is firmly grounded, knowing that as you are sharers of our sufferings, so also you are sharers of our comfort. Yes, it was in verse 4 there that we read the words, so that. Paul says, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. But before we comment on that, perhaps we first should notice that the word comfort appears many times here in our reading in this text. In fact, in those 5 verses that we read, verse 3 through 7, the word comfort appears no less than 10 times. The basic idea in the word, as you know, is to draw alongside, to draw near for our help. And it brings to mind immediately the picture of a young child who's fallen and, say, grazed her knee, and she cries out and mother rushes to her side and draws alongside for her help and for her comfort. I think the best prayer that we can offer for anyone in time of difficulty, such as illness, is to pray that they will become aware, become very conscious of God's presence, of God's nearness to them at that particular time. So here's the first reason then why God may allow suffering to come into our lives, so that we may comfort others who are in any affliction with the comfort which we ourselves were comforted by God when we were afflicted. The reason is so that we can empathize with others and pass on as a ministry the lessons learned. It's about sanctifying the distress that we've been through and allowing it to minister to others. I remember the story about Douglas Maurer of Missouri. When he was a teenager, Douglas became rather unwell. He had a very high temperature, which persisted, and he had flu-like symptoms. And eventually his mother took him to the doctor. And the doctor, or later the specialist, diagnosed leukemia. And they said to Douglas that he was going to have to go through radical chemotherapy, that he would go bald, and that his body would bloat. Now, for a teenager, as well as for anyone, of course, but maybe particularly for a teenager at that stage of life, he was tremendously depressed by the thought of going bald and his body bloating. And so, in his depression, his aunt decided she would send him some flowers. She went to a florist and she explained to the young assistant why she was sending those flowers to her nephew. Well, in due course they arrived and adorned Douglas's bedside cabinet in the hospital. When they arrived, he looked at the card and saw they were from his aunt. But then he noticed there was a second card, and he picked that up too from among the flowers. And it read, "Dear Douglas, I hope you don't mind me writing to you like this, but I'm the assistant in the florist shop where your aunt placed this order. And I just wanted you to know that when I was 7 years old, I too had leukemia, and now I'm 22 years old. Sincerely, Laura Bradley." You know, Douglas was in that hospital bed and he was surrounded by millions of dollars worth of the best medical equipment. And he was surrounded by doctors and specialists who had his best interests at heart. But you know the thing that brought him the most cheer and comfort and help and will to get better? It was that message from Laura, because she had been where he was now, and she had survived and could pass on a message of hope. Well, other examples in a similar vein would be Johnny Tada Erickson, who, when she was a young woman, had that life-changing injury. But she later used it to form a ministry to reach out to others with Christian hope, others who had a similar condition, being paraplegics, perhaps through traumatic injuries received as she had. Also, Janet Pascal, whom Brian Fullerton has recently referenced in Prayer Mail, a cancer sufferer who now uses her singing to share Christian hope and faith for others who may be suffering difficulties in life. So the first reason that Paul shares in this Bible text of 2 Corinthians 1, following on from the introduction of the first "so that," the first reason that God may allow suffering in our lives is so that we may comfort others in any affliction that they're in with the comfort that we ourselves had received from God when we were afflicted. Let's move on then to look for a second reason why God may allow suffering to come into our lives. Listen out for another "so that" as we read now together from 2 Corinthians 1 again, but verse 8 through 10. "For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren," Paul says, "of our affliction which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively, beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death, and will deliver us, he on whom we have set our hope, and he will yet deliver us. So the so that we find in verse 9 is so that we will not trust in ourselves, but rather in God. Paul had been through some very deep experience here. We know that he spent about 3 years at Ephesus during his third missionary journey. Maybe they were among the toughest times of his ministry, a defining moment in his ministry. Certainly they were extremely stressful for him. At that time, as we know from the Bible letters, Paul was grappling with serious pastoral problems in the Church of God at Corinth, across the Aegean Sea from where he was at Ephesus. And at the same time that this was going on, he was in mortal danger from adversaries at Ephesus itself. In fact, he writes in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 32, isn't it? He spoke about fighting wild beasts at Ephesus. Now, he's not thinking about any kind of amphitheatre, of course. This is not literal. A Roman citizen would never be in the amphitheatre. But it's figurative, fighting with wild beasts, in mortal danger, while at Ephesus. But by the time he's writing 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the text which we have before us, brighter news has come to him. And there's a palpable sense of relief in Paul's writing here. And it's as if he wears his heart on his sleeve as he writes this letter. He said, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, you know. We thought we had come to the end of the road. But God intervened, and it was like life from the dead, delivered from such a great peril of death. But it was all God's doing. Paul had learned not to trust in himself in any degree, but to trust wholly upon God. I'm reminded of Robert Louis Stevenson when he told of a ship that was in danger of a rocky coastline in the midst of a great storm. The announcement had been given that all passengers were to go below deck and stay firmly below deck. And the steersman of the ship alone was battling against the waves on deck. But one passenger, as they were being tossed around, and very worried as all the passengers were below deck, one passenger decided he was going to risk it and brave the element, defy orders, and he opened the hatch and he crawled out and he dragged himself across the deck to a point where he could see the wheelhouse and he could see the pilot grasping that wheel unwaveringly and inch by inch turning the wheel back again and again out to sea to keep the ship from going onto the rocks. At one point, the pilot saw the passenger and briefly smiled at him. The passenger then turned, crawled back across the deck, and went below deck again and spoke a message of cheer to the other passengers. He says, "I've seen the pilot, and he smiled at me. All is well." It reminds me of the message that we have in the Psalms. The psalmist, often in danger, spoke about seeking God's face in prayer. And there he renewed his perspective so that he could smile at the storm. And that's what we can do too. But you know, Paul realized that he was in mortal danger here, and it deepened his trust in God. The suffering that God permitted deepened his trust in God. You know, it's easy for us in times of ease and comfort to be lulled into a false sense of security and self-sufficiency. But when something like this corona pandemic comes along, then we realize just how helpless we are and how much we need God and to depend on Him. And so the second reason in our text why God may allow suffering to come into our lives is to deepen our trust in God so that we might lean all the more heavily upon Him. You know, someone has said, and it sounds like a bit of a cliche perhaps, that safety is not the absence of danger, but it is the presence of the Lord. It may be a cliche, but the psalmist would tell us there's a lot of truth in that. Safety is not the absence of danger. Paul was in great danger here, mortal danger. But his deliverance was sensing the presence of the Lord and deepening his faith and trust in God. Another reason why God allows suffering in our lives. But we must now come to the third reason in our text in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And this takes us then to verse 11. And let's read that verse now. Listening out, of course, again for the words so that, which introduce us to another reason, the third reason why God may allow suffering to come into our lives. Here's verse 11. You also, joining and helping us through your prayers, so that thanks may be given by many persons on our behalf for the favour bestowed on us through the prayers of many. So the third reason that our text shares is so that, in retrospect, we might look back on the hardship and give God thanks, and other people will have cause to give thanks to God also. I'm reminded of the story of a Norwegian carpenter who belonged to a church in Chicago, and this church was donating clothes for an orphanage in China. And because he was a carpenter, this chap was given the task one Saturday morning of boxing it all up in crates and getting it ready for shipping out on ship to China. That morning, he had just bought a new pair of reading glasses, and he had tucked them in his pocket. But on the way home, when all his duties were completed, he felt for those glasses, and they were no longer in his pocket. And it dawned on him what must have happened because they had been in his top pocket. And while he had been bending over one of those crates, sealing in the clothing, those glasses had slipped out of his pocket and had gone into one of the crates. And so by now they were all sealed up and heading out for China. Now, it was the time of the Great Depression, and this man had 6 children. So he could ill afford to buy another set of new glasses. So he felt a very keen sense of frustration, which he took to God in prayer. Lord, why have you allowed this to happen while I was doing a good deed for other people? He didn't understand it. But many months later, the manager of the orphanage in China was home on a sabbatical, and he was going around the various churches in the US that had supplied clothing for the orphans. And he came to this particular church in Chicago, and he said, I want to thank you for all the clothing you sent, and also for the glasses that you sent. He said, because when the communists swept through the orphanage, they even trampled on my glasses. And he said, I was no longer able to keep the books. I couldn't see very well, and I had frequent headaches. And I prayed about it. And when your crates of clothes came, when I opened one of them, there also on top was a pair of glasses. He said, I picked them up and I put them on, and they were a perfect fit for me. The right prescription. Problem's over. So I want to thank you for supplying also the glasses. And there on that back row that morning, there was an old Norwegian carpenter with tears streaming down his face because he realized that the master carpenter had overruled and had it all in his plan, so that at this point in time, looking back, this chap, the Norwegian carpenter, could give thanks to God that his hardship had not been in vain and God had done something very wonderful through it. And so Paul shares that thought with us here. The third, so that. The third reason introduced to us why God may allow suffering to come into our lives in all his sovereignty. It's so that later we can look back and glimpse something of his purpose if he permits it. But we and others can give thanks for what we've gone through. Paul could do that, and he shares that with us here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. So we want to thank Paul for sharing with us in this text 3 reasons, the 3 so that's, why suffering may come into our lives, so that we may pass on the lessons learned and empathize with others who are now going through what we've gone through, and we can minister to them. Secondly, so that we learn not to trust in ourselves, but to wholly trust and lean upon God in times of difficulty, and indeed at all times. And thirdly, so that we can one day look back with thankfulness to God for being with us and bringing us through such trouble and even glimpsing his purpose in it. So thanks for the opportunity of sharing with you this Bible text, spiritual insight for troubling times.